The theme of Ethics Week, we normally don't have a theme, but we do have one this time. It's called Ethics, Morality, and the Life Issues. But my personal choice is continuing the conversation. I think the conversation really started in mid-May at the Notre Dame graduation. Reasonable voices in the form of Bishop John Darcy, Father John Jenkins, and President Barack Obama began to talk. So confrontation became conversation. Today, to help us continue the conversation, is Bishop Kevin Rhoades, the newly appointed Bishop of the Fort Wayne South Bend Diocese. And he comes to us, to Indiana, from Pennsylvania, a state that has sent many great people to Notre Dame. These are all quarterbacks, okay? Johnny Lujack, Tommy Clements, Terry Hanratty. Is there anybody better than Joe Montana? So here's a new quarterback of the Fort Wayne South Bend Diocese, Bishop Kevin Rhoades. His topic today is going to be ethics, morality, and religion, their impact on the abortion issue.
Thank you, Dr. Milani. This feels like Mass. Everyone first sits in the back and the front seats are empty. I like being called a quarterback. I played intramural football, and I was on a team in the seminary. And our team was undefeated. And then the quarterback got injured, and the rest of the team had to decide, and the coach, who's going to be the quarterback? And we were in the playoffs at that point. I was chosen to be the quarterback, and that was our first and only loss all season. I'm grateful for the invitation to be here with you today, and was glad to hear the topic, the focus for the week being, as I read it, the ethics and economics of abortion. So I've been asked to talk about the abortion issue from the perspective of ethics, morality, and religion, which I'm glad, because that's kind of my forte. But before tackling this topic, I'd like to say a word about how this week and its focus ties into the Catholic mission of the University of Notre Dame. As I'm sure most of you know about the document Ex Corde Ecclesiae of Pope John Paul II about Catholic universities. And he said in that research in a Catholic university necessarily includes the search for an integration of knowledge, a dialogue between faith and reason, an ethical and a theological perspective. And that the Mendoza School of Business, College of Business, sponsors this Ethics Week is a demonstration of Notre Dame's promotion of this integration of knowledge, especially as it considers the ethics as well as the economics of abortion. And as a Catholic university, it does so obviously inspired by the Christian message, by Catholic ideals and principles. And I think this is one way for Notre Dame to be faithful to its Catholic mission and to serve the church and, of course, to serve society. So I want to thank you for this contribution to the church, to society, and for the opportunity to speak to you today. Now, in approaching the issue of abortion from an ethical and religious perspective, particularly from a Christian perspective, we look to a fundamental message of sacred scripture, the dignity of human life created in the image and likeness of God. Our faith teaches and reason confirms the transcendent dignity of the human person. And respect for this dignity is the basis of a truly just society. We believe that something of the glory of God shines on the face of every person. The whole community, including the business, economic, and political communities, have a responsibility to safeguard and promote human life and dignity. When we consider human rights, the first and most fundamental is the right to life, from conception to its natural end. It is the condition for the exercise of all rights. Abortion, far from being a right, is a particularly serious moral disorder, what the Second Vatican Council called an unspeakable or abominable crime. Therefore, the Second Vatican Council called us, and really all people, to protect life with the utmost care from the moment of conception. The Church's mission includes the service of life and the service of love. Standing against the forces of the culture of death, which sometimes seems to have the upper hand, we work to promote the culture of life because we believe that human life is sacred and inviolable at every stage. Proponents of abortion rights try to justify their position in the name of the rights of individual freedom. And that's what I would like to address this issue, because I believe in looking at the abortion issue, we have to seriously consider the meaning of freedom, particularly from the ethical and religious point of view. And we have to consider the issue of the legality of abortion in our democratic society. And in looking at this, as you'll hear, I'm particularly guided by the wisdom of Pope John Paul II, who was truly a philosopher, but also a theologian. As Americans, we celebrate and we cherish our freedom. We work to promote and defend freedom at home and abroad. And we've opposed totalitarian regimes which have oppressed peoples and their rights as human beings. We promote democratic systems of government, and we're proud of our own constitutional democracy. The Catholic Church, too, greatly values the democratic system, as it ensures the participation of citizens in making political choices, guarantees to the governed the possibility both of electing and holding accountable those who govern them, and of replacing them through peaceful means when appropriate. Now, we all know of Pope John Paul's influence in the collapse of communist totalitarianism in Poland, Eastern Europe, and eventually the Soviet Union. Shortly thereafter, in his great encyclical, Centesimus Annus, an encyclical, by the way, that many business leaders and business people asked the Pope to write, Pope John Paul wrote about the harm and the errors of totalitarianism, particularly in its Marxist-Leninist form. He wrote that totalitarianism arises out of a denial of truth in the objective sense. If there's no transcendent truth in obedience to which man achieves his full identity, then there is no sure principle for guaranteeing just relations between peoples. And what happens? The force of power takes over. People are exploited. The Pope wrote, "The root of modern totalitarianism is to be found in the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person, who, as the visible image of the invisible God, is therefore by his very nature the subject of rights which no one may violate, no individual, group, class, nation, or state." The totalitarian state fails. It sets itself above all values. It cannot tolerate the affirmation of an objective criterion of good, an objective criterion of good and evil, beyond the will of those in power. So the Church values the democratic system. We as Americans are rightly proud of it. At the same time, we must beware, also in democracies, of embracing the fundamental error of totalitarianism, the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person. Our founding fathers recognized and proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence that there are objective truths and inalienable rights, laws of nature, and nature's God, which governments are meant to serve. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision violated these most noble ideals. Pope John Paul II wrote, again in Centesimus Annus, "Authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law and on the basis of a correct conception of the human person. If there is no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. As history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. Freedom attains its full development only by accepting the truth. Democracy, to survive and to flourish, needs, as our founding fathers knew, and as Pope John Paul II taught, an authentic and solid foundation. The explicit recognition of human rights, the most important being the right to life. The Catholic Church teaches in the Catechism that the inalienable right to life of every innocent human individual is a constitutive element of a civil society and its legislation. This right is not a concession by society or the state. The inalienable rights of the human person belong to human nature and are inherent in the person by virtue of the creative act from which the person took his or her origin. Pope John Paul elaborated on this theme again in his great encyclical, The Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. He again recalled the horrific crimes against humanity committed by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. But he asked an important question. When a parliamentary or social majority, and I might add a Supreme Court, decrees that it is legal, at least under certain conditions, to kill unborn human life, is it not really making a tyrannical decision with regard to the weakest and most defenseless of human beings? The Pope warned against idolizing democracy to the point of making it a substitute for morality or a panacea for immorality. And he taught the world something extremely important, especially for us Americans. He wrote, fundamentally, democracy is a system, and us, as such, is a means and not an end. Its moral value is not automatic, but it depends on conformity to the moral law, to which it, like every other form of human behavior, must be subject. In other words, its morality depends on the morality of the ends which it pursues and of the means which it employs. The value of democracy stands or falls with the values which it embodies and promotes. Our founding fathers recognized what they called self-evident truths. They acknowledged an objective moral law. The natural law written in the human heart is the obligatory point of reference for civil law itself. It is necessary for the future of our democratic society that civil law conform to this objective moral law. And Pope John Paul courageously and wisely urged us and the world, for the sake of the future of society and the development of a sound democracy, to rediscover those essential and innate human and moral values which flow from the very truth of the human being and express and safeguard the dignity of the person. Values which no individual, no majority, and no state can ever create, modify, or destroy, but only acknowledge, respect, and promote. Of course, the value of the dignity of every human being from the moment of conception to natural death is the most fundamental. So we might ask, how is it that we, in our great nation, the most famous example in the world of the democratic ideal, came to the point of authorizing and legalizing abortion? And we're even moving in the direction of authorizing euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide. How has this happened? By fiat of the Supreme Court? But what about laws that have been enacted by legislatures supporting abortion and euthanasia? What about the pro-choice opinions of many voters, no longer, by the way, the majority, who support abortion or euthanasia, at least in certain circumstances? I believe that Roe v. Wade has in some respects erroneously led many people to accept that if something is declared legal, it is therefore right. Laws and Supreme Court decisions have a moral influence in forming people's opinions. And that's why the educational efforts of the church and of Catholic universities like Notre Dame are so essential and important. The root problem, it seems to me, in our country and also many other Western democracies is twofold: ethical relativism and a distorted notion of freedom in our society and culture. Prior to the conclave which elected him Pope, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger delivered a stirring homily where he spoke about relativism, which he described in the words of St. Paul as letting oneself be tossed here and there, carried about by every wind of doctrine. He said, "We are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's ego and desires." Now, the expression dictatorship of relativism became the soundbite that was reported by the world media, you may remember. The dictatorship of relativism today is a path into darkness and destruction, reminiscent of the totalitarian dictatorships of the 20th century. As John Paul noted in Centesimus Annus, totalitarianism arose out of a denial of truth in the objective sense, and such denial is relativism. Ethical relativism denies the existence of objective moral truths and binding norms. Ethical relativism sanctions the decadence and disintegration of reason and the principle of the natural moral law. The history of the 20th century demonstrates that those citizens were right who recognized the falsehood of relativism, and with it the notion that there is no moral law rooted in the nature of the human person, which must govern our understanding of man, the common good, and the state. Now, John Paul tackled this problem in another great encyclical, Veritatis Splendor, the Splendor of Truth. This is an encyclical I think should be in the hands of every Catholic college student in our country. There he also treated the question of freedom and its relationship to truth. According to Christian faith and the Church's teaching, only the freedom which submits to the truth leads the human person to his true good. The good of the person is to be in the truth and to do the truth. And then in another encyclical, Faith and Reason, Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul wrote, "Truth and freedom either go together hand in hand, or together they perish in misery." Authentic freedom does not exist without the truth. And that's a little side note. I firmly believe that for Catholic universities like Notre Dame, to be truly Catholic it means witnessing to the truth, believing in this objective moral law that there are universal truths. Now, when we see contempt for human life in the name of freedom of choice, we see the urgency of this problem. This is a result of ethical relativism, the refusal to acknowledge the enduring absoluteness of the value of human life and its inviolability. And it's also a result of a distorted view of freedom. The authentic meaning and purpose of human freedom are found in this orientation to the true and the good. In Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul wrote, "Certain currents of modern thought have gone so far as to exalt freedom to such an extent that it becomes an absolute, which would then be the source of values." You could say the same thing about academic freedom. The pro-choice movement has exalted freedom in this erroneous manner. What it promotes is abuse of freedom. The freedom to kill an innocent human being isn't true freedom. It's license to do evil. And Pope John Paul rightly insisted on freedom's dependence on truth. God has bestowed us with the gift of free will and the possibility of choosing between good and evil. Yet, as Pope John Paul reminded us in his homily in Baltimore back in 1995, and I remember this very well, being in the stadium. I was rector of Mount St. Mary's Seminary at the time. We brought the whole seminary community there, and when he said this, the whole stadium erupted. This is what he said: "Freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought." This is the teaching of the church. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states this. It says, "The more one does what is good, the freer one becomes. There is no true freedom except in the service of what is good and just. The choice to disobey and do evil is an abuse of freedom and leads to the slavery of sin." Pro-choice advocates not only deny the fundamental moral truth about the inviolability of the life of every human person, ethical relativism, they also distort the truth about human freedom. The choice to kill an unborn baby is an abuse of freedom, and it brings harm not only to the innocent child whose life is taken, but also to all who participate or cooperate in the evil act. So many women who have had abortions have suffered as a result, many having been deceived into thinking that the choice to abort was an exercise of their rightful freedom, to later discover that they were anything but free after the destruction of their unborn child. The church's ministry to women who have had abortions is vitally important so that the wound left in their hearts is healed and true freedom restored through repentance and God's merciful love. Perhaps what I've been saying can be summed up very simply in the words of Jesus. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Freedom finds its fulfillment in the truth. And that's the main message, really, I want to leave with you today, as you consider this week the ethics and economics of abortion. And I hope and pray that this great Catholic university will always bear witness to the truth about the sacredness of human life and the inviolable right to life of the innocent unborn. This universal, objective, and unchanging moral truth serves our true freedom as human beings. It is a truth known from within, through reason, by its natural knowledge of God's eternal law. The natural law written and engraved in the heart of every person. Unconditional respect for the right to life of every innocent person from conception to natural death is, as Pope John Paul II taught, one of the pillars on which every civil society stands. Our nation needs to recognize, as our founding fathers did, that its primary duty is the defense of the fundamental rights of the human person, especially of the weakest among us. Only respect for life can be the foundation and guarantee of the most precious and essential goods of society, such as democracy and peace. May the University of Notre Dame and each one of us bear witness to the truth about the dignity of human life and be committed to truth, love, and authentic freedom. May God bless you.
Our usual format is to go about a half an hour with the presentation, and now we'll open it up to questions and answers or comments. So we'll take the second question first, because the first question is always the toughest one to get out of first. So raise your hand.
Yes.
How do you adjust to the freedom of discussion at a university level? I know there's not an absolute here, relative to a Catholic university still needing to be true to its faith community and its purpose?
Yeah. And that is an excellent question. And it gets to the whole notion of academic freedom as well with faculty and professors. But even when we talk about discussion on campus, freedom of discussion. And I think Pope Benedict, when he was in Washington, what was it, in 2008, I think gave us some good insights on that, in which he talked about the important value of academic freedom and discussion. And he praised it. He said it's important, especially in an academic environment. But at the same time, the freedom isn't an absolute. So therefore, if you have someone on campus, just as a simple example, propagating anti-Semitism, professor in a classroom or a student group on campus, whatever, anti-Semitic propaganda that leads to contempt or hatred for Jews, would we tolerate it as a Catholic university in the name of freedom? No, because it's harmful. So there are limits to this freedom. And I think that's what I've been trying to get across here, and that limitation is the moral truths. The moral truth about the transcendent dignity of the human person. So this not only is about abortion, it's about anything that degrades others, that there are certain things like that cannot be tolerated. And I think being Catholic, that's fundamental for us, that we stand up always for the transcendent dignity of the human person. And that means we need to correct, not tolerate, however you want to say it, or reprimand, however you want to say it, those who propose views that are not respectful of the dignity of human life. I hope that answers your question. How you have to look at each situation. It becomes challenging, but I think there's certain more, the fundamental principles that that are not really gray areas, that are pretty black and white, like abortion, like racism, and other things like that. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much for coming and presenting your thoughts on this important question. I think, and I'm professor in business ethics here, so not about abortion, but about business and ethics. But still, I have an interest in foundational ethical questions. I think an important issue, and I certainly fully agree that ethical relativism is not an acceptable position. But I think the issue of abortion in a democratic society is not just about ethical relativism, because there are people, honest people, who have an opposite view on when a human being is a human being, becomes a human being. And this is a very strong, there are very strong opinions in different directions. And so even if we, from the Catholic side, say that the sacredness of human life begins with the conception, there are other, also religious people who deny that. And so how can we say that we are in the truth and they are not in the truth? I mean, to say that to hold the truth in hands is a questionable thing. And so how to address the issue of pluralism, ethical pluralism in a society. And I think here we have to think about two things. First, what can we say reasonably from our Catholic tradition, and what can we say to those who do not share our Catholic tradition, but are honest people and people who seek the truth?
I think you've asked a very excellent question, and I think it really gets to how we know truth, how the knowledge of the truth. And we look at faith and reason. And I think as Catholics we see the complementarity of faith and reason, the great St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. And I think when we look at the abortion issue, for me our faith is clear on this, and there was unanimity among Christians about the immorality of abortion for many centuries, until recent decades, really. Going back to Scripture and the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. In the early church, very clearly, we have evidence in the 2nd century of the church considering abortion as an evil. And that was the consistent Christian tradition, even when they speculated about when the ensoulment took place. Even if there were questions about the human soul and personhood of the unborn child, they still considered abortion evil because it was the destruction of life, and you always take the morally safer course if there is a doubt. But I think our beliefs, our faith, is also confirmed by reason. And I think any scientist, any biologist will admit that from the moment of conception, we have a new life that begins. I mean, I don't think this is just a matter of faith. I think it's a matter of science. It's a matter of right reason. I mean, that developing being in the womb of the mother is not going to turn out to be anything else but a human person if it's allowed to develop and to be nourished in the womb of the mother. So I think these are very, I just think that those who have contrary views, and I think even a lot of pro-choice advocates nowadays, and I've been in discussion with several of them, will admit that that is a human being. But even with that admission, believe that the freedom of the mother supersedes the rights of the unborn child. I don't find too many people anymore who say that's not a human life. They'll admit that, but believe that there's a higher right, the right of freedom, which, as I said, is a distorted notion of freedom. So anyhow, should we have, definitely, there is a need for respectful dialogue on the issue. We've talked about the need to be engaged with those who don't hold the same opinions that we have, people like President Obama, working together to try to reduce abortions, etc. But at the same time, I think it's very dangerous, the path that we are on, which seems to me to go against not only our faith, but also right reason. There's also, I think, and we see a number of I've seen a number of people who had the, quote, pro-choice position, who, after study and reflection, have also changed to a pro-life position, and that is also possible. Again, through good philosophy sometimes, and sometimes just through a conversion of heart. Yes?
How would you counsel those who are opposed to abortion in terms of what is the appropriate limit of actions? Recently, we had a man convicted of murder, of killing a doctor who's obviously done many abortions. How does the faith community view what's appropriate and beyond which is probably not appropriate?
I mean, we would contradict ourselves by using violence. I mean, the killing of the abortionist, the Catholic Church bishops condemned that action immediately. using violence or killing others in order to, the ends do not justify the means. So anyone who would use violence for the cause of life is contradicting himself or herself. We can only use peaceful means, and I think there are some fringe elements in any movement, including in the pro-life movement, but they're very few. And peaceful protest is the only way that we will fight this terrible evil. Hopefully trying to change people's minds who are against us, but also, as I said, changing laws, because oftentimes laws are formative in our society, and people think if something's legal, it's therefore right. So we also do, the church is active in the public arena, and we should be. We have a right to be. We have a right because abortion isn't just a political issue, it's a moral issue, and we should make our voices heard. The March for Life, it's difficult in our nation too. The March for Life is probably the largest annual event in Washington, D.C. Notice how it gets virtually no coverage in the secular media. I'm so glad to see, I think it was nearly 400 students from Notre Dame at the march this year. And you see, 300, 400,000 marchers, it wasn't even covered in the news, which shows the bias of the secular media, or much of the secular media. Yes?
Hey, you see a lot of, when you're talk about the relativism, people that, there's a lot of people out there that, their heart's in the right place, but in fact, the idea of, well, if I can't impose my will and life on other people, it's a free country and they can do what they want. How do you go about empowering people to take a strong stand for what they believe and more truth?
One of my best friends was like that back in Pennsylvania, and he was really, personally opposed to abortion, but he never did anything about it. He felt that others felt differently. That's fine. And there was I don't know what changed him to become more actively pro-life. He goes to the March for Life now, and he's outspoken. He's very involved in various pro-life activities. There was just a moment where I guess the evil of abortion just hit him as he reflected on it, and I think there was a bit of a spiritual conversion. I also think sometimes there's a lack of courage, that it isn't easy sometimes to stand up for our faith, for what is right and good and holy. It's an easier way to just go along with the flow, but I don't think it's really respectful in the long run towards others if we don't share with them the truth that sets us free. I think we are called to do that, not to just, that's what Jesus called us to, is to go forth to all nations and bear witness to our faith. And I think that's one of the things we need. We need courageous Catholics in the world today who aren't afraid to bear witness to their faith, and especially our young people.
So often I think folks who are acting in the pro-life movement are encountered by good, faithful Catholics who propose the seamless harmony explanation or justification for not being so focused on pro-life activity. Do you have any comments or encouragement or thoughts for folks when encountered with that from other faithful Catholics?
That's a good question. I had to deal with that somewhat on both sides, because there is I set up in the Diocese of Harrisburg a commission on Catholic social doctrine to help me to deal with the whole range of life issues, whether it be immigration, respect for immigrants and the justice for immigrants, We were involved in a lot of different things. So, but it was never seen as the seamless garment approach, as if every issue is equal. We had to be very clear on what are the preeminent issues, because the preeminent issues are those that are that attack life in itself, like abortion, euthanasia, as I mentioned, or physician-assisted suicide, or embryonic stem cell research. All those which involve the actual killing of human beings are preeminent. But that doesn't take away from other important social justice issues that we also should be concerned about and act with. But at the same time, always keeping that clarity that there's a hierarchy here when we're dealing with these different issues. And when we're talking about human life itself, and who are the most vulnerable and the weakest in our society, it's the unborn children. So I think when I'd be interviewed by the media about this, and that would be a question, I always made that distinction. Yes, we're concerned about all of these issues as Catholics. We have to be concerned about justice and human rights in every way. I mean, the people of Haiti who are suffering so much. I mean, we have a moral obligation to go to their assistance, to help those who are left homeless, etc. The church is very involved in social ministries. But in the end, the most vulnerable among us are those who are waiting to be born. Therefore, there's a preeminence of that. Yes?
Yeah. I like the way you locate the problem with the natural law. And did you have a strategy in Harrisburg when you were bishop of basically, whether it was in grade schools, high schools, university, whatever, of getting people to confront that truth? And I mean, I think it absolutely at the heart of the issue has to do with, does a person have the capacity to admit that the moral law is true? Because once you do, then you have to take the pro-life position. But was there a strategy that you had as bishop to kind of promote that?
I think a lot of what I said in this talk, we had as part of our Catholic educational system. I mentioned about everyone having every college student having a copy of Veritatis Splendor or of Evangelium Vitae. I think a lot of it is education. I think it's extremely important in our religious education programs that we help form the consciences of our young people. I have to say, you mentioned natural law. With children, they naturally are abhorred by the idea of abortion. I mean, I think if there's any evidence of the natural law, there's a natural abhorrence to killing an unborn child. It's only later that one can perhaps be, trained or whatever to disregard what is really a natural sense that human beings have of the dignity of human life in the womb. That's evidence for me of the natural law. But I think we have to do a better job in our catechesis. I think not only in the education of the young, because they will be, as they grow older, they're going to be influenced by secular media, by contrary points of view. So we have to have good educational efforts, and on the adult level. I think one of the big problems we have is a certain illiteracy regarding Catholic teaching within a few generations. I think we've seen improvements in recent years in our catechetical ministry, of our catechetical programs. So I think education is a big part of it, to answer your question. I think that's extremely important for us. Yes?
Well, in Catholic social thought, natural law approach is one approach. It's not the only one, and it's controversial within philosophers, Catholic social teaching. I would like to ask you how, in that range of life issues, what role does the death penalty play? I mean, the death penalty means an organized, by the government, legitimized killing. This is not allowed in any European state, but in the US it's allowed. So what does the natural law tell us?
Yeah, I think That's another very good question, because that is one of the life issues. And I think Pope John Paul, if anyone, was very clear that capital punishment, that the death penalty should not be used. But there was a distinction, though, in the level of moral gravity between the death penalty, capital punishment, and abortion. Because in the case of abortion, we're dealing with direct killing of innocent human life, which is always and everywhere wrong. In other words, it's an intrinsic evil. Whereas, when you look at the death penalty, there are certain situations where it has been sanctioned for the protection of human life. Now, for example, a criminal who is so dangerous that if the society had no other way of protecting itself, it allowed for the killing. Again, it's not innocent human life. Pope John Paul said, in society today, especially in our country or in the West, there is the possibility of protecting society because we can have life imprisonment without parole. So he said the reasons that would allow for the death penalty are really no longer existent in society today. But in a sense, where it would be licit is in self-defense. The Church has always said self-defense is permissible killing. Yes?
I wonder about your thoughts relative to the recent healthcare debate. I mean, it seems pretty interesting that the church made a very strong case for the need for healthcare, made a very strong case for protection of human life. It does become, as a Catholic, I'm confused, a bit difficult to understand where the church is making a sort of stronger statement versus leaving more to discretion.
You know, the Catholic Church's position really doesn't fit into any of the political categories in the healthcare debate, healthcare reform debate. And that's why it is a little bit confusing for people. But on the other hand, it's so consistent that it makes ultimate sense. We believe, and again, it's kind of connected as a life issue, we believe that as part of human dignity, that every human being has a right to accessible health care. And therefore, we could be considered liberal in that sense, or on the left, because we believe in universal health care, the right to health care as a human right. On the other hand, though, in the whole debate, we are insistent that no health care reform package can include abortion and must include respect for the rights of conscience of healthcare workers. Very strong that abortion is not health care. And therefore we would not accept, even as strong as we are, and I don't know anyone as stronger proponents of universal health care in this country than the Catholic Church, but we will not accept anything if that health care includes the killing of innocent human life and adequate protection for the consciences of healthcare workers. And therefore, the original House bill that came out, the Catholic Church had a strong influence in the development of that in the Stupak Amendment, which would forbid any federal funding of abortion. But then the Senate bill came out, and some of those provisions were not there. So therefore, we couldn't support the Senate version of the bill. And then everything has stopped, as you know. A lot of people are confused about the whole thing. But it's the Catholic Church that is standing up and saying we cannot, we should not give up the efforts at healthcare reform in our country. It is a moral imperative. So I think you're right. And I think we have to be clear, perhaps, with our people in the pew about where we stand. The bishops have tried to be. Our website, the USCCB website, presents the church's position, I think, in a very good way, and I think that's a good educational tool for people. But that's where we stand. Thank you. Yes?
I kind of misunderstood, but it was also my understanding that government health care would violate the principle of subsidiarity. So even without the federal funding for abortion, at least I thought it would violate the dignity of the person.
Government, right?
Government to get their hands that deep into the person.
I could be wrong, but my understanding of the bishop's position is that that's an issue of legitimate debate. The level, the extent of government involvement, and how that all works. I don't think we're not really proponents of I think that's something for others to decide, but we're not dealing with the moral principles. I think some can argue, as you just have mentioned, from the principle of subsidiarity. But I don't think it's a black and white issue that the bishops, at least, have taken a position on.
So, I mean, I guess I kind of think of that more from the stance that the way our government is now, in moral relativism, there is, in our government, it would violate the person, but if our government was more back to origins where they were actually using, absolute moral truths as the basis for governing, that it could potentially be negative for us to have.
Well, that would be an interesting question. I would have to, ask that question of how more government involvement in providing health care violates the dignity of the human person.
Well, I guess I mean in terms of it seems like it would be very likely for health profession in the current state.
And deciding who would have preference in receiving certain.
Right.
I mean, right now it's a matter, but right now I would say the system is unjust because you have people who need it who are denied it because of the lack of insurance. So I think we're in an unjust situation right now. Yes.
Well, the principle of subsidiarity means two things, to solve the problem at the lowest possible level in a society, but also to have the subsidy, the aid from the government, from the top or from the superior level, if the lower level cannot solve the problem. It is both. It's not just going down, it's also going up. And so to find the right balance is a difficult thing. But some people interpret the principle of subsidiarity only in terms of going down. That's only 50% of the principle.
That's a good point. Yes. Yes.
I was wondering, as a major part in the culture of death, what should Catholics strive for in regards to public policy on artificial contraception?
That's another very, very difficult issue with the issue of artificial contraception. I think at this point, the battle that we're involved in that area on the political side of things is the protection of the conscience of Catholic healthcare workers, pharmacists, doctors, etc., not to be forced to administer artificial contraception. And I really think that is where most of our efforts, our energies, and our resources as a conference of bishops is. And but if we talk about education, I think I talked about education regarding the abortion issue. We're far from educating well our people regarding the morality of contraception. I think the best approach that is working now, especially among young people, is the theology of the body. And I promoted that a lot in the Diocese of Harrisburg, and I know so many young couples who are following the Church's teaching, having been convinced in their mind and in their heart through the theology of the body. Yes?
Do you
We
believe
got
that,
time for one more question?
sorry. Do you believe that artificial contraception should be illegal then?
I've never thought about that, but I think it would be impossible in this society to do that. I think it's morally illicit, obviously, as the Church is teaching. But to outlaw it, I think one of the dangers is we have to, or one of the primary things is we have to educate our people. When you have 90% of the population of a democratic society thinking it's okay, it's going to be impossible. So I think the issue is, at this point, is education. And I don't know of any, I don't know if there are any countries in the world.
Well, where would that line blur then? Because wasn't that one of your fundamental arguments against abortion and how the legality of it is made
Well, there's a hierarchy of truths and values, too. And what I've been addressing is the top hierarchy, the top truth in the hierarchy, which is the life, protection of the life of the unborn child, the life of an innocent human being. So there are many other things besides artificial contraception, other evils that are also legal in our country. So, but they're not issues of the highest importance as the dignity of human life and the sanctity of human life. So,
Thanks, Kevin.
thank you.
Let's get to the bottom line. I think Kevin did a terrific job giving us a discourse on distortions that are dysfunctional and the dignity of life that is our destiny as Catholics.